Well, like Alan and Jeff, I'm very honoured to be able to speak at this event. To me, Professor Nevin, as I knew him, because I'm a bit younger than the other two speakers, was one of my heroes, I think, and I even have one of my kids called Edward. Whether it was due to him or not, I'm not sure. But to me, he had a great influence on my life. Like many others, Alan, I wasn't influenced by his textbook. And I must admit, I'm a bit surprised, because I thought it was an A-level textbook, and you got through Leeds University on it? I was somewhat shocked by that, but I didn't actually use the textbook. So I actually ended up in Swansea in 1974, and that was on the back of a cousin who used to be Deputy Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, who recommended it to me because of a young professor had just gone there called Michael Artis. But I entered Swansea and I studied economics, and I would have expected, well I wouldn't have expected, but most students might have expected to have Ted or Professor Nevin in their first year because of the A-level textbook he'd written. But I didn't. I think he was actually away in America, and I was taught by somebody called Charlie Blitch, who actually did a chapter in Jeff's book written to celebrate the life of Professor Nevin in 1994. So I didn't actually get him in the first year. But I did come across his work in economic history modules I did in the first year and the second year. And I would disagree possibly with Michael that in his book about his father's life, he talks about on page 122 that his father's work does not exercise much influence today. Well, whether it's influence, I'm not sure, but when I retired in 2019, I was still citing Professor Nevin's work in my economic history lectures. And his work was, for example, if we look at the work on the gold standard, which has already been mentioned, I think, by Michael, and his book on cheap money. I'm just going to give you a quote, if I can read it correctly with my skew-eyed. The immediate cause of the breakdown, and this is referring to the gold standard in 1931, and as Michael suggested, these were fairly desperate times for the economy. You had miners' strikes a little before that, and the Great Depression. So the immediate cause of the breakdown are therefore considerably less significant than the fundamental causes. If it had not come in 1931, it would have come sooner rather than later, in the years immediately following. If the chain had not snapped in Austria, the rot and the rust would have conquered elsewhere. If the chain had not snapped in Austria, the rot and rust would have conquered elsewhere. What wonderful prose. I think of all the stuff I've written, nothing is ever as good as that. And looking at other people in the room, it may be the same. He had a wonderful way with words. And I suppose that's why he tended to write textbooks so well. And he was a wonderful teacher. So I was taught by Professor Nevin in my final year on a module on economic growth. And I always remember he was basically an inspirational lecturer. He had detail, he had content, he had humour, and he would dot his presentation, his lectures, with stories. And one of the stories I remember is about Harry Johnson. And as a student, you're always impressed when your lecturers actually know somebody who's very eminent. And like I said, I hadn't known Ted's textbook. I did know his work on cheap money. But at that time, Harry Johnson was like an economic god. If you picked up a reading list in economics in the 70s, macro, international money, they would all be numerous references to the work of Harry Johnson. And I remember, and I think Michael picks it up in his book, he told us that Harry Johnson used to write more before breakfast than most academics write in a lifetime. And that's certainly what he did. He could write. And so it was fascinating when you were in a lecture with Ted, you were getting the content, the theory, the rigour, but you're also getting these stories that went along with it. And there's some stories I can't tell you now about academic staff being sick in guest lectures. I was supposed to leave that one out. About Harry Johnson whittling wood in lectures, but it was all, we were just fascinated as students. I also was supervised my final year project, and I'll go a bit forward here because I'm in my group of 30 students who graduated that year with Professor Nevin. I know 3 went on to be professors of economics. Another started his own business and sold out for tens of millions to a subsidiary of Microsoft. Another one went on to be a finance director of a large multinational, and the other one, who was a bit of a failure, went on to be mayor of Cardiff. But I don't know what happened to all the others, but 4 of us I know, I don't know about the other 2, 4 of us were supervised by Ted in our final year. And then went on to be mayor of Cardiff, did something on devolution. But I've spoken to one of the others, and we all remember the influence he had. I remember going into the room with Ted, and if he was always willing to see you, but woe betide you if you weren't properly on top of your material, because that meeting would be short. You'd be out the door pretty quickly. And you knew next time you went there, you would be thoroughly prepared. He was clearly an inspiration. I was also, as a student in Swansea at that time, aware of his media work, and I think Jeff has mentioned sort of Good Morning Wales and Meet for Lunch, and I always remember him on budget day. He would be a fixed asset there. You'd be sitting in the studios on the telly, and he'd have his programmable calculator where he'd be looking at the influence of the budget and typing in numbers. I'm not sure whether it did anything or whether he just knew what he was going to say anyway, but it was like an adding machine, a glorified adding machine that he'd be on the telly with. And I also remember at the time he also was on the telly talking about inflation. And what he did, he looked at, this was the 1970s, and he was looking at basic commodities like bread, cars, luxuries like cars, and estimating what their price would be in the turn of the century, 2000, if inflation had continued at that rate. And it was only a year ago in Wales, and I know a lot of you have come from, I think, Scotland, is it? So you don't tend to get the same TV, thank goodness, as we get in Wales. But we do have a TV programme about a year ago called Wyn's 1970s. Now, if you probably are aware of Wyn Evans, he's an opera singer, does the Go Compare adverts, and he was on Strictly Come Dancing. And he used to have these to sit on the settee with his dog, and then there was a programme for each, 1971, 72, 73. And I remember seeing this clip of Ted again talking about the rate of inflation. And to be honest, he wasn't far out with bread. I think on a Ford Anglia he was probably a long way out. But I mean, to a certain extent it's fascinating. I did try and look on iPlayer to see if I could get a clip of that, but unfortunately they aren't on iPlayer. They may come around in 10 years' time on Dave or something, so you may be lucky enough to see it in Scotland. He also had, I think, an eye for quality academics. I'm not saying that just because he appointed me, though I was the third choice, I think, of the 3 appointments on that day. But he did appoint Mike Artis to a chair at 34, and Mike Artis eventually left Swansea after a couple of years with a young academic called Derek Leslie, and who went to Manchester. At that time, I think, Michael, you might have gone to Manchester. It was one of the top economics departments in the world. Manchester took on Chicago, the other North American great university. They lost, but still, to be playing against Chicago was impressive. You had Jack Johnson, Dave Laidler, Lipsy, other people at Manchester. Sadly, no, it's not the department it was. But I think that was a frustration to Ted, because I was also taught by Jeff Horton, who had been from the Treasury for a couple of years. There was a Graham Richards from Australia. There was Howard Pettit, who'd come from the LSE. We were taught by lots of very inventive young academics, and I think we had a lot of academics who were a bit old in the tooth who weren't that impressive. I think we can name them, Fritz probably, but we won't here, it would be inappropriate. But we had some very impressive young lecturers who stimulated us. And I think it was a bit of a frustration for Ted, in as much as he would attract these young academics to Swansea, but they saw it as a stepping stone to somewhere else. So they didn't stay long enough. But he did manage to bring in talent after talent. And I know there are some people in the room who were also appointed later, who stayed a number of years, made the contribution but moved on. That was the sort of model that existed in the 1970s. But as a head of department, it must have been terribly frustrating to see these talented people move on. So the effects on student was clear. His lectures were detailed, they were focused, they were inspirational. I left Swansea then, I went to Manchester, did a master's and a PhD and worked on a research project, and then I came back in 1982 to take up a lectureship. And I always found him to be very supportive, and basically I found him inspiring, an inspiring person to be around. He was always very student focused, and I think that's something that he basically ingrained in his staff. I mean, I mentioned that we four of us had him in our third year to do our dissertation. I think that was just, there would have been a lot more. People go to the LSE and they never get to meet these very eminent academics. Ted was there, he was making himself available for students, some of us not that clever at that time. But he always had time for us as long as we were taking the subject seriously. At that time in Swansea, he always also published a textbook for management science students, and he went sort of in that direction a little bit. We had close ties at that time with the School of Management, and Ted actually ended up in the School of Management at the end of his career. But he did write a textbook, and obviously he also wrote The Economics of Europe, which was published in 1990. Again, a very readable student textbook, and to a certain extent I think that's where he was interested. He was certainly interested in things European, and that's where his teaching finished off. In Swansea he was also working on public sector pay. I've left out the stuff that you gentlemen have mentioned on public sector pay, and in particular he was advisor to the police. And myself, as a labour economist, always found the debates with him very interesting and challenging. It was great to be around talking about real world issues that he was addressing. His research in Swansea in the later period was probably around his academic career as head of department. He was head of department in Swansea for about 20 years, so some of his papers related to teaching and being a head of department. So in 1972 he wrote a paper on how not to get a first in the Economic Journal. And as an academic we're always impressed, publications in the Economic Journal carry some weight. So I was a student slightly after that, so to see your professors publishing in the top journals was very impressive. I remember reading that paper as a student as well. And there was some interesting stuff as I went back to reread it. What he found is, for example, that economics, social sciences and art students didn't get the number of firsts and 2-1s that you might have expected compared to science and applied science, given their A-level or their GCSE quality. So to a certain extent, he was looking at the number of firsts and 2-1s and saying, well, look, in arts and social science and economics, we're not given enough compared to science and applied science. He also looked at economics degrees across departments. And what he found is that these ranged, people getting a first in economics in the 1970s, 10% from Bristol, less than 1% from Hull. Now, he said that wasn't down to student quality. Well, I would debate that with him. I've got a colleague in the room who went to Hull, and so I'm not surprised he didn't get first personally, but perhaps if he'd have been to Bristol, he certainly might have. But these were issues that Ted was interested. He was interested in how students achieve achievements. The second paper I'm going to look at is a paper published in 1985 in a journal called Applied Economics. Not quite as prestigious as the Economic Journal. It was the first place I published, and it did manage for me to get a job in Swansea. So for me, Applied Economics has a special place in my heart. I can't remember, Lester, I think you published in there early on as well. Not that you stopped there, but you went on. But it was, for many of us, it was an important, it wasn't quite the EJ. But what Ted was looking at was the finance of economics departments. So again, this is something you are concerned with as a head of department. You've got to make the figures add up. And he noted this was what we call in economics a classical resource allocation problem. So it's not a big issue if you can invert 70 by 70 matrix. Trying to do a resource allocation model for economics is fairly simple. But what he found is that more than often than not, it was based on the power of persuasion and the art of special pleading. So this is how money gets allocated in departments. Rather than Ted said, this is a simple problem, but it wasn't, because universities had some other system. So he set out clearly a model in which departments could be allocated their finance. He did acknowledge that there were obviously cases where discretion would be important, so it just wouldn't be a mechanical process. You had to bring in judgment and discretion. Now, the number of good degrees continues to be an issue for today. And many people are concerned that there's been grade inflation in universities. I mean, we talked about Ted Nevin, 1%, under 1% of people getting a first at Hull. Nowadays, you would get, I know Swansea, Nigel, do you remember the number of people who got first last year?
15%.
15%. 15%, oh, only that? I'm surprised, I thought it might have been higher.
Standards, David, standards.
Standards have actually improved since I've left then. But what Ted would, so these issues are still a concern to academics. And I think many of us felt that this is basically the result of university league tables, which have caused grade inflation in universities. And I know Ted, in both these articles, How Not to Get First and Finances, talked about some of the issues about the way economics could be taught in universities, which I found quite insightful. So Ted, to conclude, I think Ted was basically committed to providing students with a clear, concise lectures in economics, and for me and many other students, I think we're entirely grateful. He was an inspiration. He set high standards but provided support, and I, for one, will always be in his debt. Thank you.